Well, let me begin by expressing my appreciation, deep appreciation to this community of faith for the honor you have bestowed upon me with the Brooks Hayes Award, to be mentioned in the same sentence as a leader who engaged so directly the most challenging and for many people controversial issues facing the community, the state, and the nation is humbling indeed. The courage of conviction he modeled was clearly deeply connected to his faith as a person who sought to follow Jesus. And I was reminded in reading about him that the question, what would Jesus do, was not one that just surfaced in the last few years. In that spirit, I want to speak this morning, and in a different and a more detailed way this evening, about what I believe is one of the most pressing and urgent questions for people of faith today. It involves questions related to theological education in the 21st century. In particular, questions about Christian self-understanding and commitments with respect to the urgent issues of religious diversity in our communities, our country, and our world. Many important questions arise today at the intersection of Christian faith and religious diversity. How can we, as people of faith, reach out beyond the confines of our own faith, our own language, even our ideas about God, in order to encounter people of other faiths? How will we develop real bonds of friendships and relationships with others in our increasingly diverse, increasingly interdependent, and far too quarrelsome human family? The questions are right before us in the headlines virtually every day. From despicable slaughter of people in a Jewish delicatessen and people working at Charlie Hebdo in Paris, to the graphic murder of a Jordanian pilot at the hands of the self-proclaimed Islamic State, to a vigorous debate engendered by President Obama this week at the National Prayer Breakfast. Now more than ever, I believe it is imperative that people of faith and goodwill seek to engage and better understand one another, and intentionally seek ways to work together in order to realize a more hopeful and healthy future. This is not easy. Where do we find guidance and insights to help us engage constructively the serious and very difficult challenges posed by religious diversity, by religiously inspired violence and extremism, and by the various machinations of religion and politics that characterize so much of our world today? I believe we find a great source of hope in an intentional process of continuing theological education. Theos is the Greek word for God. Theology means the study of God. Theological education, our ongoing process of learning about God, is indeed just that, an ongoing process. No one has it all locked down with nothing more to learn. Now, I realize that even as I speak, there are a number of people in pulpits in various places this morning, and many more who have TV ministries, who act as though they have all the answers. They don't. No one does. We are all in a process of growing and learning and changing, and sometimes unlearning things that we thought we already knew. If everything was locked down, why would you be listening to sermons or going to Bible study or Sunday school or on retreats? Presumably, there's something more to learn. There are new insights, new ways of seeing things. We are all in a process of theological education. I often ask people, in fact, this is a great question to ask clergy, how often do you go back and read your own sermons from 10 or 15 years ago? And when you do, what's it like? The honest ones will wince and often say, well, I would say things a little differently now. I would nuance this a little differently. I've done this myself. And there have been a few times when I found things in previous sermons that were stunningly brilliant. I would amaze myself at what I'd said. And then it dawned on me, if it was so brilliant, why had I totally forgotten about it in the last 15 years until I read it again? We are all in a process of growing and learning and changing. How many of you would be interested in hearing a sermon from somebody who hadn't had a new thought in the last decade? We must be engaged in a process of theological education, and sometimes this involves unlearning some of what we think we know and changing our behavior substantially. Consider the matter of slavery and our history here in the United States. For 18 years, I lived and taught at Furman University and Wake Forest University in North and South Carolina. And it is striking, it is disturbing, it is distressing to go back and read the sermons of the vast majority of clergy 150 years ago and less, who were absolutely certain that the Bible proved slavery and that this was indeed what God ordained and wanted. Through a long and often contentious process of theological education, including the exemplary actions and efforts of people like Brooks Hayes, we found over time a significant shift in that understanding of who God is and what God calls us to do and who God calls us to be. We have new understandings about our sense of God's justice and God's love for all creation that actually permeate the biblical text, but were not so obvious to a lot of people living, at least in the Carolinas and elsewhere, for a long, long time. Or think of the horrific history of Christian anti-Semitism. The deplorable treatment of Jews by the majority of Christians for some 2,000 years is deeply, deeply disturbing. Happily, in the last 60 or 70 years, Jewish-Christian relations have emerged in conjunction with various initiatives in theological education. And while much work remains to be done, and anti-Semitism, like racism, is certainly not gone from our midst, a new day has clearly been dawning. And so the destructive behavior of a large majority of Christians for 2 millennia is visibly changing. And many who claim to follow Christ now approach their Jewish neighbors and friends with a very different frame of reference than has characterized the history of Christianity. Serious and healthy theological education involves critical thinking and a willingness to challenge presuppositions of others, and sometimes, in fact often, our own presuppositions. It may also lead us to substantially change our minds, though it's important to underscore that not all people of faith and goodwill will necessarily come to the same conclusions and the same understandings. That good intentions, thoughtful pursuit of understanding isn't going to necessarily mean we all come out in the same place, and indeed the process continues. My own exploration in the area of theological education, particularly in relation to religious diversity, was helped a great deal by a very traditional Southern Baptist minister in my hometown of Tulsa. I had completed my undergraduate study at Oklahoma State back in 1972. I was preparing to head off to seminary. At the time, I was serving as the youth director in a Baptist church in Tulsa. The minister there was the stereotypical Southern Baptist preacher evangelist type. He was the kind of minister that had us sing at least 16 stanzas of Just As I Am every Sunday morning because somebody needs to find Jesus. As a result, we never could get to the best places for lunch ahead of the Presbyterians or the Methodists. One of his favorite lines, "Let the pot roast burn, somebody needs to find Jesus this morning." So, very stereotypical Southern Baptist preacher evangelist type. I was preparing to go off to seminary, and I was sitting with the minister and his wife and his children, all of whom were pretty close to me in age, and said to him one Sunday afternoon after church and dinner at their home, "You know, I'm very interested in studying and learning more about world religions and wrestling with issues of Christian particularity and pluralism. I want to know more about how I can be a person of faith, a Christian with commitment and integrity and depth, but also in a world where my experience of God surely doesn't exhaust all the possibilities." I asked him point blank, "What do you think about God's activities beyond the walls of the church?" His answer stunned me, and even more his children, who had been forced marched to church about 5 nights a week their whole life. He said, I'm 95% sure that God is doing all kinds of things that we don't perceive. The Bible, he said, is not a book about comparative religion, but there are many places where it's quite clear that God is the God of all creation, that God's love extends to all creation. I then asked the obvious question, then why do you say the things you say and do the things you do? And his response was this. He said, I'm 100% sure of what God has done in Christ, and whatever else God is doing, whatever other theological understandings I might come to, it doesn't change my responsibility to bear witness to the good news of God in Christ. But I'm quite sure when we get to heaven, it's going to look very different than any of us ever imagined. At this point, we were picking the children up off the floor who'd never heard such a thing from their father. I realized in that exchange, and he told me, he went on to say, don't be afraid to pursue the truth, to study, to see where this leads. Don't be afraid of that. And I realized in that very liberating moment that even people who have what would appear to be a very traditional and exclusivist understanding can have some pretty soft edges and some openness when they realize that in fact we are not God, and God may well be doing all kinds of things that go beyond our particular experience and understanding. The Baptist pastor underscored how rich the Bible itself is as we seek to pursue a deeper understanding of God and God's work in the world, as we pursue theological education in the 21st century. Sometimes it helps to read the Bible as if for the first time. My good friend Marcus Borg, who just recently passed away, wrote a wonderful book some years ago, and several wonderful books, reading the Bible again for the first time. And it's a great exercise to come to the text as though you've never seen it before and just see what happens, see what you learn. This happened recently in a comparative religion class I was teaching at the University of Oklahoma. The students had read Genesis 1 through 11. Many of them, like those of us here today, were quite familiar with the stories of creation and so forth, and the early prehistory of Israel. And we were discussing some of the major themes in these passages when one particular student, who really wasn't very familiar with the Bible at all, sort of got all of our attention and made a few observations as somebody who had just read this for the first time. She said, it's very interesting. There's kind of an experimental thing going on here, where God is creating things and declaring them very good, but then by chapter 3, everything is really going south in a hurry. And she talked about the story of the fall in the garden. And by the time you get to chapter 6, God is so frustrated with this whole project, he decides to flood the earth and start all over again with Noah. And by chapter 11, things have regrouped. God has promised, I'm not going to do that again. That was pretty harsh. But then by chapter 11, you've got the Tower of Babel story. Her observation was, and we began to explore and discuss these themes, she said there's a pattern here. It seems to be a pattern of new beginnings, problems that lead to dramatic actions, a kind of regrouping and another new beginning. Woven into that, I think, are powerful messages of hope. After repeated human failures, God continued to provide new beginnings and new opportunities. We know the flow of sacred history that follows the patriarchs, exile and slavery into Egypt, the coming of Moses and the Exodus, events celebrated in the Jewish tradition of Passover. And on the sojourn to the Promised Land, Moses receives the Ten Commandments. This, too, is a story of new beginnings. It becomes the cornerstone of the legal framework that marks the approach that we see in biblical Israel. And the story of Israel itself in the Hebrew Bible is an ongoing saga of failure and renewal, as prophetic figures emerge time and again to challenge the comfortable, often arrogant, religious and political establishment. The prophets continually call the nation back to the moral and ethical imperatives at the heart of their religious tradition, beautifully echoed in the chapter and verse read from Micah this morning. The Hebrew Bible is filled with stories of human failure and new beginnings. The fact that we live today in exceedingly dangerous times is not unique in human history. The scale of potential disasters in front of us are larger and more comprehensive, to be sure, economically, environmentally, socially, but the perils of life are not new. For us as followers of Christ, strength and hope for the journey in the 21st century, I think, began in the life and ministry and the reconciling work we find in Jesus and the witness and support of those who have gone before us. The words of the book of Hebrews literally leap to mind. We are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. And so let us run the race that has been set before us with endurance, fixing our eyes upon Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. The New Testament itself includes some very powerful examples of theological education going on in the first century. Let's look for just a moment at this intriguing passage in the 10th chapter of Acts, the Cornelius story. The story of Peter and Cornelius, I believe, speaks very directly to us today. The story moves at several levels. I want to focus just briefly on Peter in particular, for I think this is an intriguing and compelling story of Peter's theological education. Peter, the disciple perhaps closest to Jesus, is woven into the fabric of the gospel stories and clearly is depicted as a leader in the early church in the book of Acts. In this passage, we are learning some things about Peter as he is learning some things about God. I encourage you to take a few minutes sometime later today, find a quiet place, and read the 10th chapter of Acts in its entirety. Peter is called through a miraculous vision and an angelic visitation. It's a very strange passage where he has these very strange dreams. He is called to go to the house of Cornelius, who is a Gentile. We learn in the passage that God has heard the prayers and received the alms of Cornelius. Cornelius is a righteous person who is not in the nation of Israel and who is not in the church. But God heard Cornelius' prayers and received Cornelius' alms. In the story, you can literally see and feel Peter learning and growing and stretching in his theological understanding. This is the person who walked with Jesus, the cornerstone of the church. And right before our eyes, we see him learning things he never imagined possible. When he reaches Cornelius' house, he's clearly uncomfortable. I love this passage. His first words after he's had this angelic visitation and these incredibly powerful dreams, you'd think with a direct mandate from God, you would sort of get on the stick and do whatever you were told to do. And yet, what's the first thing he says when he walks in the door? He walks in and he says, you yourselves know that it is unlawful for me as a Jew to even associate or visit the home of a Gentile. In other words, I don't feel good about this. This goes against everything I've always believed and always been taught. This is illegal for me to even be here. He's clearly not comfortable by where he finds himself. And yet, he goes on to say, God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. Even though it's very difficult for Peter, at this late stage in his ministry, he begins to model a kind of openness to an understanding of God's work in the world that he had not conceived as possible, apparently, prior to this time. He's growing in his theological understanding, and in the process, I think, we too are invited to expand our understanding of God's work in the world, perhaps beyond the borders of Israel and beyond the walls of the church. A little later in verse 34, Peter makes what is a truly astonishing statement. Now I truly understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. That's an astonishing statement coming from the lips of Peter. It's a remarkable and inclusive affirmation. Peter's eyes are beginning to open to the work of God in the world in ways he had not imagined previously. The Scriptures can be a lamp unto our feet and a guide on our path. And Peter's story, I think, reminds us vividly that sometimes our comfortable theological maps and frames of reference may be inadequate. Peter needed more theological education, and so do we. For more than a quarter century, Pope John Paul II modeled something of this same message. While John Paul II was very traditional in many ways, in the area of interfaith understanding, he was a very progressive pioneer who was really living out the dramatic changes that occurred in Vatican II in the 1960s. In 1985, 30 years ago, John Paul II addressed a stadium with 80,000 Muslims in a football stadium or soccer stadium in Casablanca. Listen to the words of John Paul II from 30 years ago and think about what's in our headlines today. Quote, he says to 80,000 Muslims, "We believe in the same God, the one God, the living God who created the world, in a world which desires unity and peace but experiences 1,000 tensions and conflicts. Should not we believers come together? Dialogue between Christians and Muslims is today more urgent than ever, and it flows from fidelity to God. Often in the past, we have opposed each other in polemics and wars, but I believe God today is calling us to change old practices. We must learn to respect one another, and we must stimulate each other in good works on the path to righteousness." In 1986, John Paul II invited leaders from all the major religions and many other religious communities to Assisi for a day of prayer. He chose Assisi for a very specific reason, because Francis of Assisi modeled the kind of openness that was very uncharacteristic of the history of the Catholic Church. He modeled a kind of openness to others. It's not inconsequential that the current Pope has taken the name Francis. And if you're listening very carefully, you'll see he is pushing in all sorts of ways, it seems, to challenge Catholics and others to begin thinking differently about some issues that have been long held in the largest Christian community in the world by far, the Catholic Church. Pope John Paul II was the first pope in history to visit a mosque, which he did twice in Egypt and Damascus. He was the first pope in history to visit a Jewish synagogue, which he did in Rome and again in Jerusalem, where he met with Jewish and Christian and Muslim communities. There's a great deal more, but I think over the years we're going to learn more, especially through the lens of the current pope, who is picking up many of the same themes and emphases that we saw on these issues with John Paul II. The point is that Peter and John Paul II recognized on some very basic issues that traditional ways of thinking about God and about others outside our community were no longer adequate. Narrow thinking that fails to see that there is only one community, the human community, is theologically suspect and increasingly dangerous in our world. If we continually open ourselves, we find, I think, invaluable resources for our ongoing theological education in biblical accounts that point us to continuing human failure, but the creative, renewing activity of God in response to our failures, misunderstanding, and misbehavior. We find great hope in the ministry of Jesus, of course, and the life-changing experiences of one like Peter. And even as Baptists, we find great insights in the leadership of people like John Paul II and perhaps Pope Francis as well. I wouldn't begin to suggest that there are easy answers or simple solutions to the problems that we face today, but I believe there are ways to move forward constructively toward a better future on our fragile planet. We know well that the challenges ahead are many and they're formidable. The road will be circuitous and fraught with danger, but we are not alone. We are indeed surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, those who have gone before us, including Peter and John Paul II, people who invite us to open ourselves to an ongoing and refreshing process of theological education and Christian vocation, even as we fix our eyes upon Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith.